Stone Baby by Sarah Evans. A man and woman lie side by side. She is propped up on one elbow, her gaze sweeping down the length of him. "Stop it," he says. "Stop what?" "Ogling. Just looking." The foreshortening of perspective, the flow and ripple of skin, the underlying structure of muscle layered on bone. "Well, don't." She can hear the smile in his voice, and her eyes drift up to see how his lips are curling. His head is flung back into the pillow. The hair, conker brown, luxuriant, all awry. "You're beautiful." He laughs then, a tremor through his body. "Don't be daft." "You are, though." And he is. But then she can no longer observe, because his arms, muscle, sinew, bone, have reached out and wrestled her beneath him, until all she can see are his eyes, dark, intense. "I love you," he says. "Don't," she whispers. "Don't spoil things." Eleanor leant back to critically observe the line and flow. Something was wrong, or rather, it wasn't right. Dust had seeped through the face mask, and it caught in her throat. She turned aside and raised the mask to cough, stirring up yet more dust. She pushed her hair back from her forehead, and she could feel the grit on her skin. Dust everywhere. She stood up, knees creaking after their prolonged stint of kneeling, and continued to survey what she had achieved, aware of the itch of dissatisfaction somewhere deep within, unscratchable. This was getting her nowhere. The slab of stone refused to release its life force, remaining just a lump of granite, pale and dull. She'd been here before. A temporary loss of focus. Outside her studio, the air was sharp, and the breeze lifted the dust from her clothes, the motes swarming around her like a cloud of midges, and she coughed again. It was an occupational hazard, the persistent irritation to her lungs, along with broken fingernails, and the grime embedded in the fissures of her hands. In the kitchen, the kettle built its head of steam. She reached for tea. Licorice, cloves, cinnamon. Refreshing and calming. From the window, the sky was banded in layers, and the black branches of a tree pierced the expanse of grey. She could hear nothing but the whistle of wind and the wheeze to her breathing. Another day. The same mattress placed directly on the floor. The two of them lying side by side, their racing hearts and hot breath slowly settling. "I'll leave her." The words pierced the quiet aftermath, and then ebbed to nothing. He shuffles, breaking the contact of skin on skin. "Well?" "Well, what? Aren't you going to say anything?" "What would you like me to say?" "For Christ's sake!" He thinks she's playing some sort of game, but she isn't. She'd like to hear his answer. "We hardly know each other." She says it deliberately, picking out each word, and her hands move over the surface of his chest, the smooth skin, the rough scattering of hair, the give to flesh and rigidity of ribs, as she tries to gauge what is inside. Well enough. But they don't, she thinks. No, anywhere near enough. She thinks of the silence of stone, its patient endurance, how she's only just learning the ways in, and how she has to leave it and come back, allowing her thoughts to take form before she applies her chisel and commits. We shouldn't rush anything. What sort of answer is that? It is her answer. If he wants to leave his wife, he should leave, she thinks. He doesn't need permission. She is not convinced that what they have is permanent, founded solidly on rock. The tea failed to soothe. She felt impatient to return to work, yet reluctant. Nothing would be achieved through force of will. She needed to impart something of herself to receive back from the stone, the give and take of sculptor to unsculpted granite. Her trip to London had left her edgy. All the while she'd been there, she had longed for the resumption of her daily discipline, her immersion in work. She'd slept badly in the blank box of a hotel room, with its wide bed and landslide of puffed-up cushions. She had mingled badly with the fashionable throng, who crowded her Kensington exhibition, mingling and chatting amongst her thicket of sculptures. What she had created from peace felt as out of context as she herself did amidst the bustle. Now she was back, but had failed to rediscover her usual purpose. Restlessness, stirred up like dust, refused to subside. He had been there. The thought wouldn't rest. The two of them have started something. The idea appears, is dismissed. Then it takes hold, like the thing that has latched on inside her. Her breasts are sore, and she feels different, somehow. Her mind floats around the notion and fails to settle. She ought to tell him, doesn't want to. His perspective will alter hers, like when a teacher took her work to task. Too banal, too imitative. And the criticisms wrapped round some inner core, and the more she tried to fight them, the more they seemed to tighten. And it was months and months before she completed another piece. You seem distracted, he says. Lying in bed, their natural medium, sweaty and unclothed, the heating high, the lighting low, no clocks on view. She tries to imagine the two of them occupying that other dimension of coldly lit, fully dressed day. The world of making a living, of responsibilities, schedules and domesticity. Uh-huh. She hears the soft exhale of exasperation. What does that mean? It means I'm distracted. He sits up abruptly. She thinks how he has not yet left Helen, how he should not have needed her complicity. Yet without it, nothing has changed. He twists his head and looks down at her. But she thinks he doesn't have an eye for detail, for perceiving what lies beneath. I want this, he says. I want you. But you often seem so distant. I can't get close. Their legs are still entwined. Only recently, he was inside her. Part of him remains embedded deep within. A small nub that, if left, will grow. But he's right. They are not close. Not in the way they would need to be. The phone rang, and it startled Eleanor out of all proportion. After all, it was what phones did. They sometimes rang. Only after she'd picked up and heard the familiar lilt of Kay's greeting did she remember how he did not have her number. The exhibition had sold well, and her agent was upbeat with the update. Eleanor ought to feel content, not so much for money and recognition, but for what they had bought. This freedom to live as she chose, her daily experiment with line and form. Her hand twisted the phone cord round her wrist. She was not listening to Kay. Not really. He had come. The thought persisted, like a woodpecker chipping at a tree, like a chisel tapping against rock. She'd pictured often how he might do so. The practice of imagined meetings had been no help. She remembered the face-slap, heart-skip shock, seeing him standing there, older, broader, the bones of his face sharper. He seemed lost in contemplation, gazing at a visage that emerged as if from sand, one half smooth and formed, the other only crudely carved, so that to an untrained eye it might appear unfinished, a part-excavated fossil. She wanted, like the deer she glimpsed in the woods, to disappear. What purpose could a conversation serve? Except then he turned his head, and she looked into his eyes, across the head-bobbing, shoulder-barging space of her exhibition. Eyes unchanged from 2 decades ago. I think we should end this. The words echo coldly round the room. He becomes very still. The man who accuses her of not speaking is now himself silent. You mean, he says eventually, we should stop seeing each other? Can I ask why? Always he has this tendency to slip into hurt, assuming her to be in the wrong. You have Helen, I have my work. He moves brusquely. I said I'd leave Helen. You haven't, though. And there's a wing beat, in which she waits for him to say something that will convince her otherwise, that will reverse her resolve, which is not yet fully set. But you... Words continue to fail him. To fail them both. She felt the bubbling of panic as she walked briskly towards him, adhering to London's rules of engagement. Russell, she said. Eleanor. What are you doing here? He laughed. Laughter lighting the way it always had, his whole body. Nothing like getting to the point. She'd never been good at social niceties. It had bothered her once, in that time before she discovered that other people's opinions did not really matter. I was curious, he said. Isn't that allowed? I like your exhibition. No, you don't. It emerged harsher than intended. He laughed again, an easy tremor through the body that was thickened now from the narrow angles she remembered. Art never was my thing. No. You've become quite well known, it seems. It seems? And you? Not well known. I meant, I know. You look prosperous. That was the soundbite that emerged, reflecting back the designer-label jacket, the close-clipped hair. I'm good. Work. Well, I seem to be good at what I do. Still married? Yes. I mean, no. Divorce. In the middle of. He shrugged, and she found herself searching his eyes, replaying his words to uncover their meaning. Was this, then, why he had come this year, not some earlier one? We waited till the kids were a bit more independent, he added. And she didn't ask, didn't want to. How many or what gender? What about you? Not in the middle of a divorce. I meant a recluse, according to the Times. That was the word the journalist used, and she bristled against its brutal truth. I saw. And happy? Fulfilled? As much as anyone. She caught from the corner of her eye how Kay was steering a brightly lipsticked woman her way, a potential buyer from the looks of her agent's smile. Sorry, she said, aware of how much there was to be sorry for. I'm needed. Sure. He was looking at her intently, and in his eyes she read all those unanswerable questions. Why? What was it that had happened between them? Why hadn't they grasped their chance? I won't keep you. Why don't I? His hand moved to his upper pocket and fumbled round like a caught mouse. Give you my card. The fraying card that now lay beside the phone that rarely rang, in the thick-walled, converted barn she had bought for its seclusion. At the clinic, the hardest part is the initial questionnaire. Has she fully thought this through? Does her partner, the father, know? Would she like counselling before making her decision? Yes, she says. Yes, then no. The dishonesty is uncomfortable. Not the lie for this green-smocked woman, but the deeper one. She swallows down pills. And now it's too late. Too late to say she needs more time. Too late to go back and tell him what perhaps he had a right to know. Too late to wind it back to the beginning and resist. Resist. His dark eyes, his teasing smile. The nurse tells her what to expect, and she's packed off home. Back in the studio, she tried to see what was wrong with her piece, but it eluded her. Her mind occupied elsewhere, near and distant history merging with one another, the past more compelling than the present. It simply wasn't working. The emotion was missing. The chipped away at form emerging from a hunk of igneous rock was failing to take flight, to acquire lightness and life. What was she left with when the stone refused to answer? When it remained closed? Remained simply stone? She wrapped her arms around herself and thought of the way he had smiled and leant in to kiss her lightly on the cheek, and she caught the half-remembered feral scent of him. She thought of the way he had, all that time ago, smiled at her as she lay beside him, and of the particular arcs and concaves of his body, and how over the years these had found expression in her work. She remembered how her decisions had been hard and necessary. She still thought they had been necessary. In her studio, just a shed in the yard, she throws herself into her work, labouring in a controlled frenzy which is unfamiliar, preserving this moment, this feeling for all time, until the cramps hit and she is forced to go and lie down, curling up like an ammonite, her hard exterior coiling around the emptiness inside. Later, she calls the piece Stone Baby, and it becomes the first she sells, setting her on her way, a path without distractions, giving herself up to the tender embrace of rock.